In early 1900s New York, one woman became the face of fear and illness. Mary Mallon, later known as Typhoid Mary. Was she simply a victim of circumstance, or a reckless carrier defying the warnings of science? Although she felt perfectly healthy, she unknowingly spread deadly typhoid fever, leading to her forced isolation for years. But was this isolation a necessary act of public safety, or a cruel punishment for a woman who never felt sick? Imagine spending 2 decades in isolation for no good. Step into the haunting story of Typhoid Mary, where fear, science, and the battle for freedom collide. A journey that twists between science and superstition, between guilt and innocence, leaving a legacy that still haunts public health today. Imagine a time before antibiotics, before public health systems were able to track every carrier of illness. A time when diseases like typhoid fever could sweep through communities, leaving destruction and death in their wake. In this landscape of fear and vulnerability, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, New York City was a melting pot of immigrants and rapid urban expansion. Crowded tenements and inadequate sanitation made it a hotspot for infectious diseases, creating an ideal environment for typhoid to spread. The city's health infrastructure was still in its infancy, struggling to keep up with outbreaks that claimed thousands of lives annually. One seemingly healthy woman became the unintentional carrier of death and illness to dozens of people. Her name was Mary Mallon, but history would remember her by another name, Typhoid Mary. Mary's story is far more than one of disease. It's about the fear, the misunderstandings, and the murky space where public health clashes with personal freedom. It all started in 1869 in the county of Tyrone in Ireland with a girl by the name Mary Mallon. Mary was born in a poor Irish family, like many Irish immigrants of the times, so she left the country of hunger and be gone. An opportunity, a chance to become home in America. At age 15 or so in 1883, she found herself in the evolving cosmopolitan ambience of New York City with great prospects. Many Irish immigrants of Mary's time fled Ireland due to economic hardships caused by the Great Famine and English rule. Life in New York City's Irish immigrant communities wasn't easy. Many worked as domestic servants, laboring in often hazardous conditions for low pay, yet domestic work was considered a relatively secure job. How many people would risk their livelihood and freedom just to make a living in a foreign land? Could there have been a way for Mary to escape her fate? By the early 20th century, she had been fortunate to climb the ladder of domestic service as a cook. Cooking was a prestigious role in the domestic service industry, especially in affluent households. Many women were relegated to cleaning or laundering jobs, but Mary's skill allowed her to climb to a more respected position. This wasn't a small task. Cooks were sought after by the rich and prosperous, hence those who loved tasty meals and excellent hostelry. Mary was said to be a good cook, and was reported to be both cooked and well recommended. Her meals were appreciated, and every now and then she got some work, which was not a common thing to find for immigrant women. However, hidden beneath her fresh, muscular look, Mary had a deadly warrant out for her. Coincidentally, she was harbored in herself the bacterium Salmonella typhi, the typhoid fever bug. At that time, this disease was almost legendary in everyone in their community, and especially in crowded and unhygienic cities. It is important to emphasize that at the time, germ theory was not very well developed, and people only suspected that diseases were caused by, for example, bad air. The idea of carriers, which people could be, and transmit the disease without displaying symptoms themselves, was exceptionally limited. In the summer of 1906, an unusual series of illnesses began to emerge in a wealthy household in Oyster Bay, Long Island. The family, along with several household staff members, fell ill with typhoid fever. Typhoid fever was feared for its aggressive symptoms: high fever, abdominal pain, fatigue, and often a rose-colored rash. In severe cases, it led to intestinal perforation or even death. In the early 1900s, the mortality rate from typhoid fever was approximately 10%, and those who survived were often left with lingering health issues. This was highly unusual, as typhoid outbreaks typically affected overcrowded, impoverished urban neighborhoods with poor sanitation, not clean, affluent estates. This pattern was strange enough that it raised questions. How could this disease, associated with unsanitary conditions, reach a well-kept summer residence? The family, desperate to understand the cause, called in George Soper, a civil engineer who had taken up epidemiology, a field that at the time was relatively new and involved much detective work. Soper was known for his investigations into outbreaks of typhoid fever and had begun studying public health practices. His approach was methodical, analyzing every detail of the household's food, water, and sanitation. Despite meticulous investigations into the water supply and other potential sources, Soper was stumped. Nothing seemed contaminated, except for one strange detail. The bacteria Salmonella typhi spreads primarily through contaminated food or water, often when someone handling food hasn't washed their hands properly after using the restroom. This is particularly dangerous in cooking, as food prepared by carriers like Mary would unwittingly pass the bacteria on to others. The family's cook, Mary Mallon, had left her position shortly after the outbreak began. Mary's seemingly harmless departure piqued Soper's interest, and he began to investigate her work history. His research revealed an unsettling pattern. Several other typhoid outbreaks had occurred in households where Mary had been employed as a cook. This connection was astonishing, and Soper began to suspect something revolutionary and terrifying. Could Mary be spreading typhoid fever without showing symptoms? Soper's suspicions led him to confront Mary in 1907. This concept of healthy carriers was new and controversial. Few people believed someone could spread disease without being sick themselves. Soper tried to explain to Mary that she might be the source of these typhoid outbreaks, carrying the bacteria without any symptoms. At this time, the concept of asymptomatic carriers was highly controversial, and many scientists doubted that such a phenomenon was possible. When Soper confronted Mary, even doctors were reluctant to believe that someone could carry and spread typhoid without showing symptoms. This lack of knowledge contributed to Mary's disbelief and mistrust of the accusations. He even offered to have her tested, but Mary was outraged. Imagine being in her shoes. You've worked hard to build a life, have a reputation for good cooking, and suddenly someone claims you're the source of deadly disease without any signs of illness. Mary was understandably furious. She denied the accusation, arguing that she had never been ill. And Mary wasn't about to submit bodily samples on Soper's demand. Distrustful and proud, she refused any further cooperation. Soper's discovery was groundbreaking, but he lacked the legal authority to force Mary to comply, so she continued working as a cook, unknowingly spreading typhoid bacteria wherever she went. As evidence mounted, public health officials became increasingly concerned. They eventually tracked Mary down, and in 1907, she was forcibly arrested by the New York City Department of Health. She was brought to a hospital where, after much resistance, she was tested. The results confirmed what Soper had suspected. Mary was indeed carrying Salmonella typhi. But there was a twist. Unlike people who'd recovered from typhoid fever, Mary had never shown any symptoms, making her an asymptomatic carrier. The bacteria thrived in her gallbladder, and she shed the bacteria in her feces, unknowingly contaminating food. Without a known cure for her condition and unable to prevent her from cooking, authorities decided the only solution was to quarantine Mary. They confined her to a small hospital cottage on North Brother Island, a remote spot in the East River. North Brother Island was isolated and used primarily for quarantine and medical isolation. Mary was confined to a small cottage and was only occasionally allowed to receive visitors. For many years, she lived in almost complete isolation, surrounded by medical personnel who monitored her condition. This decision sparked a public debate. Was it fair to imprison someone indefinitely for carrying a disease they couldn't see or feel? Was Mary's treatment harsher because she was a woman, an immigrant, or just because she was the first to be diagnosed as an asymptomatic carrier? Newspapers soon latched onto the story, dubbing her Typhoid Mary. Sensational headlines turned Mary into a public villain, portraying her as a reckless disease spreader. Mary was a single, Irish immigrant woman, characteristics that some believe made her an easier target. At the time, anti-Irish sentiment was common, and women in Mary's position were often regarded with suspicion. Some historians argue that her treatment was unusually harsh because of her immigrant status and the sensationalism of her story in the media. People became fascinated and fearful of her. The name Typhoid Mary stuck. transforming her into a symbol of the unseen dangers lurking in the city. Mary felt unfairly treated, and for 3 long years, she fought for her release, claiming she'd never been ill. Finally, in 1910, after mounting public pressure and the assurance that she would no longer cook, Mary was released. Once free, Mary struggled to find work. As a single woman with limited education, her options were scarce. Household cooking had been her primary skill, and while she tried working as a laundress, the pay was poor. The decision to work under a pseudonym, Mary Brown, highlights her desperation. She was willing to risk her freedom and health just to make a living, as laundry work was meagerly paid compared to cooking. This underscores her limited options and difficult situation. Driven by financial hardship, Mary eventually defied the authorities' order, returning to her old profession under an alias, Mary Brown. For a while, her plan worked. But in 1915, a typhoid outbreak at the Sloan Maternity Hospital in Manhattan infected 25 people and killed 2. When investigators traced the infection source, they were shocked to find it was none other than Mary Mallon. She had resumed cooking, and once again, typhoid fever followed her. This time, public health officials acted swiftly. Mary was arrested and permanently quarantined on North Brother Island. She would remain there for the rest of her life, spending over 20 years in isolation. In her small cottage on the island, Mary became somewhat of a loner. She had limited contact with the outside world, and over time, her once fiery resistance waned. Ironically, Mary was allowed to work in the island's laboratory, helping with medical tests. However, she was never permitted to handle food again. As the years went by, Mary Mallon's case became one of public health's most notorious stories. But was Mary truly the villain she was made out to be? Historians and medical experts have since questioned the severity of her treatment. Was Mary's infamous legacy the result of a few isolated incidents, or was society itself to blame for making her the face of typhoid? Firstly, it's important to remember that the science of asymptomatic carriers was still in its infancy. Mary likely didn't understand her condition, let alone how typhoid spread. As a working-class immigrant with limited education, she may have viewed public health officials with suspicion. Furthermore, Mary wasn't the only healthy carrier identified in that era. Mary wasn't alone in her status as an asymptomatic carrier. Records show that several other carriers were identified during this period, but few, if any, were quarantined as long as Mary. Some experts believe that her prolonged confinement reflected a growing tension between individual rights and the needs of public health, a debate that continues to this day. Other carriers, including men, were found, yet few faced quarantine. Why was Mary treated so harshly? Some suggest her status as an unmarried, working-class Irish immigrant made her an easier target for sensationalist journalism. Public health policies were still evolving, and Mary's case underscored the need for more comprehensive protocols. Her forced quarantine became a precedent for later cases, where individual freedoms were weighed against the collective safety of society. The media's portrayal of her as Typhoid Mary played into societal biases, casting her as a reckless, defiant woman who disregarded public safety. In the end, Mary was a victim of both circumstance and evolving public health practices. She became a symbol of fear and uncertainty, a scapegoat for a society still struggling to understand the invisible threats posed by disease. Mary Mallon stayed in quarantine on North Brother Island for the rest of her life. Despite her initial refusal, Mary eventually participated in small laboratory tasks, helping with medical experiments. Though her contributions were minor, it showed a degree of acceptance and resilience over time, as she was confined for over 2 decades. She was secluded with little appearance in public and only occasionally welcomed people into her home. She had a stroke that left her paralyzed in 1932, and she died in 1938 at the age of 69. Her case was a legal milestone in the matters of public health policy in Ohio in particular, and the USA in general, specifically the rights and limitation of individuals with communicable diseases carrier status. Today, Mary Mallon has become a legendary typhoid fever carrier, or a biological weapon telling a story and providing a lesson. It seems another lesson in the eternal conflict of liberties and responsibilities, the rule of 3 and common decency during the epidemic. Her demise remains a myopic memory of the early public health practices and the composite notion associated with carriers of diseases. Today, Mary Mallon is viewed as a somewhat misguided woman from a time of growing science, as well as a representation of disease and its impacts on history. Mary Mallon's case remains a reference point in public health law and ethics, often cited in discussions about the balance between individual liberties and public safety. Her story sparked changes in public health policy that today seek to balance compassionate care with necessary restrictions to prevent disease. Mary Mallon's story endures as a warning about the stigmatization of those who are carriers of disease. Today, health authorities use less punitive approaches, emphasizing education and community health. Yet Mary's legacy serves as a reminder that those who unknowingly spread disease are not necessarily malicious. Sometimes, they're victims of circumstance and limited understanding. The term Typhoid Mary has since evolved to describe anyone who unwittingly spreads harm to others, making her a lasting figure in public health lore. Her case has inspired plays, books, and even references in popular culture, symbolizing the tension between the duty to protect society and the ethical treatment of individuals. Mary Mallon left behind a complicated legacy. She was neither a villain nor a hero, but a person caught in the early uncertain days of public health. Her life reminds us of the sacrifices, misunderstandings, and tough decisions that have shaped how we address the spread of disease. Her story still echoes through time, urging caution, compassion, and a deeper understanding of the human impact of public health measures. If you found this video worth watching, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more upcoming videos about mind-blowing stories from the past. Thanks for watching.